At Runnymede by the Thames in suburban English Surrey, the site of the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215, there are two 20th century memorials. One is a British memorial for an American president who, from the outset, expressed a determination to do whatever was necessary to assure the survival and success of liberty. The other is an American memorial that features an English king who was equally determined to deny the liberty of his subjects.
In many ways, of course, the Americans regard Magna Carta much more highly than the British do. Until recently, if you went to Runnymede, the only memorial there was put up by the American Bar Association. There was nothing at all from the English. So the Americans have a very high regard for Magna Carta indeed.
Magna Carta is so esteemed by Americans that it has been cited in both federal and state courts more than 900 times, and since 1819, more than 100 times in the US Supreme Court. Why the Americans have such a high regard for Magna Carta stems from their own historical struggle for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, something which can only be properly understood by knowing the role played by the Christian faith and character of the pioneers and fathers of the nation. Early in the 17th century, King James I granted a royal charter to the Virginia Company of London, with the mission of propagating the Christian religion and giving the colonists certain land rights in Virginia. The governing council also had the right to enjoy the natural resources of the colonies, sharing part of the profits with the king. In 1606, 3 small ships set sail from London on their way to the colony of Virginia, with 105 adventurers under the captaincy of Christopher Newport, and with the Reverend Robert Hunt attending to their spiritual needs. In April the following year, 1607, they arrived at Cape Henry. And met a hostile reception from the native peoples living there. So they journeyed north and, a month later, sailed up a river which they named after their king. The settlers found a small island where they constructed their settlement and fort at a place which they called Jamestown. Conditions were extremely difficult, and had it not been for the leadership of its third governor, Captain John Smith, the fledgling colony would never have survived. Using the New Testament as his authority, Smith introduced the rule that no one should eat if they hadn't worked. That included all gentlemen. Although many of the first settlers and colonists brought their Christian faith and values with them, this didn't mean that they always acted in ways compatible with the teachings of Jesus. For example, the way they claimed ownership of land and resources in the New World was highly questionable. The settlers and colonists were hardly loving their neighbours as themselves whenever they displaced the indigenous native peoples with violence and warfare.
Well, if you'll read much of the literature, one of the things that is profound in the literature you read is the portrayal of the Indian people as savages. That's a constant theme, no matter what you read, they're savages. Yet when Columbus talks about when he first came into the area known as Cuba, down in that area what we may know as Haiti or the Dominican Republic this day, he talked about these wonderful peace-loving people, these people that lived in this beautiful land with harmony with the land, and such a place of perfection, the way he described it. So I wonder why, considering the wars that they had been involved in and the armies that they had and the weapons that they had, I wonder why they thought of these people as savages and not themselves sometimes, because they were the ones that were actually doing most of the warring, not the Indians.
Just south of Boston and about 600 miles north of Jamestown in Virginia lies the town of Plymouth, which holds a special place of significance in the history of America. It was at Plymouth that the first pilgrims and settlers arrived in the winter of 1620. The Pilgrims originally sailed from Holland on the 60-ton Speedwell, but this proved to be unseaworthy. So 35 pilgrims, adults and children, had no option but to join other settlers in Southampton, England, aboard Speedwell's bigger sister ship, the Mayflower. The 102 passengers and about 30 crew then made the hazardous journey across the Atlantic in cramped and unhygienic conditions. William Brewster was the elder of the Pilgrim congregation, and he attended to their spiritual needs on the 65-day voyage. On reaching harbour at Cape Cod, William Brewster led his congregation in Psalm 100 as a prayer of thanksgiving to God for their safe arrival.
My husband is the elder of the church, and he teaches every Sabbath day. And it's in the Bible written this. And my husband, he always make preparation for sermon during the week.
Before going ashore, 41 male passengers drew up and signed a solemn agreement before God and between themselves, covenanting to form a civil body politic to provide self-government with just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. This became known as the Mayflower Compact, the seed of American democracy. The religious settlers were generally of two kinds. There were the separatist pilgrims, who had removed themselves from what they considered to be the unbiblical traditions and corrupt practices of the Church of England. And then there were the Puritans, who had chosen to stay within the Anglican Church and work to purify the corruptions from within. However, it was the separatist pilgrims who mainly incurred the wrath of the authorities. They had been intensely persecuted by the Church under the policies of King James, who would not tolerate their unwillingness to conform to the requirements of the state church. As a result, many had sought refuge in Holland, where there was more religious tolerance. Eventually, and at the risk of their lives, many pilgrims emigrated to New England in order to have the lasting freedom to live their lives in accordance with their Christian beliefs and conscience, and to retain their English identity, language, and culture.
But I never fled my country, never left my King's Church. Without doubt, and I'm not arguing that it fall into some corruption, that it needs reformation, purification. That don't mean, well, if the roof leaks, do you burn down the house? Do you see what I mean? You must remain with the church, I think, that God hath born you to. And yet, we've all suffered in kind here. Now, these that went to Holland, certain that must have been a terrible place to be and a terrible way to have to be there. No, I never done.
The first winter was very difficult. Half the colonists died of diseases, probably due to malnutrition. The others only survived because of the help they received from the native peoples belonging to the Wampanoag tribe. The Pilgrims were amazed to find that one adopted member of the tribe, who went by the name of Squanto, spoke English and was already a Christian. Squanto showed the settlers how to plant corn, catch fish, and stalk deer. He also helped them broker a peace treaty with the other native tribes in the area. Governor Bradford appointed a day of Thanksgiving and invited members of the Wampanoag tribe to celebrate and give thanks unto God with them. Chief Massasoit and 90 of his men came and spent 3 days feasting and competing in running, wrestling, and shooting games. This first Thanksgiving has been followed down the years by many other days of Thanksgiving, as the American nation acknowledges the role of divine providence in its affairs at critical times in its history, especially relating to the fundamental issue of liberty. Gradually, the wave of settlers grew until there were 13 British colonies in the New World. Without exception, the charters of all 13 colonies made reference to the freedom enshrined in Magna Carta. Several even borrowed directly from Chapter 39, and all shared a common reading of English law. The Charter of Massachusetts incorporated Magna Carta into the design of its seal when it subsequently rejected colonial rule and formed itself into a commonwealth. The colony of Pennsylvania and its capital Philadelphia, named after a biblical counterpart, meaning the city of brotherly love, played a significant part in the great events of America's early history, not least because of the Christian understanding of religious and civil liberty by its founder, William Penn. In 1681, Penn had been granted a royal charter of land by King Charles II of England for what would become the colony of Pennsylvania. William Penn was a Christian of the Quaker tradition. He was a theologian who wrote critically about the unbiblical beliefs and practices of the Church of England, and he was suffering persecution as a result. On one occasion, he had been imprisoned in solitary confinement in an unheated cell in the Tower of London on a charge of blasphemy. Penn had also experienced judicial tyranny. A corrupt judge sent him to Newgate jail, even though the jury had declared him innocent. So, it's not surprising that when he arrived in the colony in 1682, he had with him a written constitution dealing with all aspects of the governance of the colony, and which drew heavily on the language of Magna Carta. About a century later, it formed the inspiration for the United States Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, lawyer and a founding father of America, called Penn the greatest lawgiver the world has produced. Philadelphia grew rapidly due to the religious toleration and Christian principles of Penn and his followers. In particular, even though Penn had been given the land by the king, he also paid Chief Tammany of the Lenape tribe for it as well, and entered into a peace treaty with him at the same time. Penn took great care to be fair and honourable so that he could be on friendly terms with the local Native American people. Immigrants came from European countries where Quakers and nonconformist Christians were experiencing hostility and persecution by state and church authorities. For William Penn and the many English Quakers and immigrants who followed his example, the British values that Magna Carta enshrined were part of their personal and cultural DNA: religious and personal freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Penn spoke of the way divine providence had been at work when the king had granted him a royal charter. He said, "My God, who has given it me through many difficulties, will, I believe, bless and make it the seed of a nation." Philadelphia, founded and planned on a grid system by Penn in 1682, soon became the most populous and important city in the colonies, and the cradle of religious and civil freedoms. For Penn, true Christian character with a biblical foundation was the basis of good government, and Pennsylvania, which he called a holy experiment in liberty, is his legacy.